Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. In our previous lecture, Dr. Price discussed an overview of ancient Egypt. The geography of Egypt, of course, and how important and relevant that was and is to Egyptian society and culture and how they developed. Also, he discussed in a previous lecture about early Egypt and how Upper and Lower Egypt, again, which we said is backwards. Upper is on the bottom, lower is toward the Mediterranean, and how they came together under this pharaoh, this king by the name of Narmer, he was called. And that the Nile River, of course, was the link, was the highway, as Dr. Price mentioned, between this upper and lower part of Egypt. And how Egypt was, at first Egypt didn't need an army. They were extremely peaceful during especially the Old Kingdom, and that allowed them to build those great pyramids at Giza and the monuments that are still, of course, in existence today. One of the surviving ancient wonders of the world, the pyramids of Giza, surviving, that is. And so Dr. Price mentioned that as well. He also discussed a little bit with Egypt about their religion and how the Egyptian religion will be a little bit different from religions in Mesopotamia. In fact, in this upcoming lecture, Dr. Price will continue with this theme of Egyptian history. He will compare Mesopotamian and Egyptian worldviews and the differences between the two. Involving, of course, religion, art, literature, their attitudes, and how these two civilizations will develop differently. Because when we talk about Western Civilization 101, and we lecture on ancient Mesopotamia, and then we have obviously other lectures on ancient Egypt, it doesn't mean that these civilizations existed back to back. They were in existence roughly around the same time frame, together. It wasn't that one came about and died off and then the next civilization came about. So it's very interesting to see some of Dr. Price's comparisons between the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian worldviews. Also, just to cover a little bit more about Egypt, we discussed quite a lot about the pyramids, and of course the first pyramid being at Saqqara, one of the earliest there, and Amenhotep. I don't believe Dr. Price, I don't think he mentioned that, but Amenhotep was the architect of this pyramid at Saqqara. Very famous Amenhotep. They always usually put him in a lot of the Egyptian movies that are out there today. He's one of the more well-known figures in Egyptian history. Also with King Tut, exactly. Yeah. King Tut is also well-known, and he kind of plays a role in a lot of these films as well. Now, Dr. Price also talked a lot about the pharaohs and the pharaohs' role in Egyptian society and Egyptian civilization. And, it was very important that the pharaohs, there was no written law. In Mesopotamian civilizations, in societies, we had the Code of Hammurabi during the Old Babylonian or the Amorite period. It was actually written down. It was like a code of laws, of behaviors, and what your consequences were if you did something in their society. With the Egyptians, they don't have a written law. The pharaoh and what he says and what he decrees is basically the law, what the Egyptians do. And so the pharaohs play a huge role, very pivotal role in Egyptian civilization. In fact, I'd mentioned this previous, but the pharaohs, building these pyramids for the pharaohs became very important to the Egyptians. We don't believe that this was a slave kind of endeavor. We believe it was more of a labor of love than anything else. And I also wanted to mention, too, the pharaohs, that the pharaohs felt it was extremely important to keep the blood pure, so to speak. And so you're going to have a lot of instances in Egyptian history where pharaohs will marry their family members, sisters, half-sisters. So it can be quite confusing, as you can imagine, when we start trying to figure out who is related, how they are all related, because the pharaohs did want to keep that, I guess, royal blood royal. Cannot fathom that today, of course, but it's what they did back in the ancient Egypt. Dr. Price also mentioned in his previous lecture a little bit about the Middle Kingdom, because he mentioned the fact that Egypt is divided into different periods. We have such as the Old Kingdom with the pyramids, we have the Middle Kingdom, we have the New Kingdom. And so he talked a little bit about the Middle Kingdom. Pretty stable and strong, not a lot of exciting, fascinating stuff that's happening in the Middle Kingdom. Pretty much the golden age until we have that invasion by foreigners. They're called the Hyksos. Foreigners is what that means. Hyksos means foreigners. And these were Semitic people. Dr. Price may have mentioned that. And I wanted to make sure that you realize that Semitic, of course, I've said this in the past, and you may have heard this in other lectures, but Semitic is it's related to a language group. You would be related to, say, Arabic and Hebrew. And that's why the Hyksos seem to be related to, say, the Old Babylonians were Semitic in nature. The Akkadians from our previous lecture were also Semitic peoples. It was their language group. So he did discuss how these foreigners will come into Egypt, which was not exactly, Egypt was protected geographically. Egypt had a lot of natural barriers that helped prevent this kind of outside invasion. So the Egyptians definitely had to, they learned from these invaders, they learned from the foreigners, the Hyksos, how to fight. They took some of what the Hyksos brought in, and at least they used that technology, so to speak, to get rid of the Hyksos. And of course, as is mentioned in the last lecture, Dr. Price, the New Kingdom was a bit more aggressive, in the New Kingdom. Egypt was very wealthy by the New Kingdom, and we see that they start, not only the Egyptians start to protect their territory, but they also start venturing out more and acquiring other areas and their wealth as well. I think Dr. Price may have mentioned Nubia and the Egyptian acquisition in Nubia with vast gold resources. And Nubia was required to pay a tribute, which is also another reason how Egypt got all of its wealth too. Had to pay tribute in gold to the pharaoh, I guess to be left alone, and that way you had a lot of this wealth coming in. Now, Dr. Price also mentioned some of the, and I mentioned this too in the past, but some of the famous pharaohs of the New Kingdom, Amenhotep, of course, because he changed the religion of Egypt into a monotheistic worship of Aton. So I've seen Aton spelled A-T-O-N, and then, of course, sometimes it's spelled A-T-E-N. But it was portrayed as a sun disk with rays shooting out of it. It wasn't portrayed as an animal or a human god or anything of that nature. But we do realize that this does not last. This monotheistic religion will not last after Amenhotep's death. Dr. Price also discussed King Tutankhamun. And I had mentioned in the last lecture about Queen, who becomes Pharaoh, Hatshepsut, because she's a very interesting figure in ancient Egyptian history. Now, what you're about to hear today, Dr. Price will delve a little bit deeper into Egyptian civilization and Mesopotamian civilization and discuss their religion and the place of myths in each of these societies, which should be very interesting. We have a lot of interesting myths that are coming out of Mesopotamia. such as the Enuma Elish, which is the creation myth, which will have some similarities, of course, to biblical history, as we will find out. And we also, he mentions the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was a Sumerian story, Epic of Gilgamesh. Discuss a little bit more about that and how they played a role in civilization around the 3000 BC time frame, or BCE, CE Common Era. Dr. Price will also discuss some of the Egyptian myths that take place. I know the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Mesopotamian myths, and the creation myth are actually very popular. But Dr. Price will compare these to Egyptian civilization and how Egyptians saw themselves as falling into in the world, and how they were created, and their feelings on religion and gods and what that would bring to them. We obviously know that, and you will hear this in the lecture, that the Egyptians definitely believed in an afterlife. We know that, which makes them very interesting and unique at this time in history. So let's find out about the differences between Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization worldviews.
The last few lectures we've been doing have been on the civilizations of the ancient Near East, especially Mesopotamia and Egypt. We have seen from their political and economic organizations that they're quite different from our own. Clearly, the ideas of Mesopotamia and Egypt about government, economic outlook, economic activity, and life in general were quite different from ours. Now, today I want to look at the ideas of these Near Eastern peoples, what we might consider, what we might call their worldview. That is, the way that they saw how their world worked. And again, we're going to see that these are quite different from ours. In early civilizations, intellectual activity and ideas were heavily influenced by geography, by weather, by activities that took place on the ground, if you will. Much more so, I think, than ours today in a more technological environment. Now, we've seen that conditions in Mesopotamia and Egypt were similar in some ways, but quite different in others. The same is true of their ideas. They share much in common, but the differences of their environment create differences in their worldview, in the way that they see their world and their place in it. The most important ideas that Mesopotamians and Egyptians shared were those that they used to explain the world. Like all primitive peoples, they explained life primarily in terms of their religion. Most primitive explanations of the natural world are based on something that anthropologists call animism. So I need to explain what animism is. At the very heart of animism is the notion that all natural phenomena are dominated by gods and spirits. There are major gods for the big stuff in the world, like the sun and the moon, mountains and rivers, abstractions like love, war. There are smaller gods, spirits, that dominate everything else. Streams, rocks, trees, animals, to some extent even people. Now, these gods and spirits controlled everything in nature. If the sun rose, it was because the sun god wanted to travel across the sky. If it rained, it was because the rain god wanted to inundate the crops and bring fertility to the land. The gods were thought, and spirits were thought to control all human activities and all human behavior. Everything that happened in the lives of individuals, everything that happened in the existence of states was thought to be controlled by gods or spirits. Animists believe that if a man's walking down the street and he stubs his toe on a rock, the reason is not that he's chronically clumsy. The reason is that the spirit of that rock had it out for him. The spirit of that rock wanted him to stumble. Likewise, if there's warfare between two cities, it's because the patron gods of those cities are at war in heaven. And of course, the city with the stronger god will win. Animists don't believe in free will, for the most part, the way that we do. If I decide to go to Sonic and pick up a chili cheese dog for supper, we would assume that that's because I suddenly have a personal craving for a chili cheese dog. The ancient peoples of the Near East would assume that some god or spirit, perhaps the spirit of past pig parts, wants me to have a chili cheese dog. And I have very little volition in the matter. For us, there's no supernatural agency involved. If I want a hot dog, I want a hot dog. Gods and spirits can either be helpful or harmful. That is, they can either do good or they can do bad for an individual. Now, the important thing here is that these entities affect our lives. And if they have such an enormous effect on our lives, then it's a pretty good idea to try to figure out how to make them happy. Because if they're happy, they'll be good to us. If they're not, they won't. One of the ways, the most important way that humans during this period figured out how to make the gods happy was through a series of stories. And these stories are called myths. Now, if you want to explain everything that happens in life, you have to explain why the gods make it happen. For this purpose, ancient peoples used myths. To some extent, we still do. A myth is a story about gods and men, or both, that imparts some essential truth about the gods, what they're like, what they want, and about heroes and how they should behave, and by and large about everything. Life, the world, the universe, everything. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines myth as, quote, a purely fictitious narrative, usually involving supernatural phenomena, embodying some popular idea concerning natural or historical phenomena. Wow, what an amazing definition. Your middle or high school teacher, if you took mythology, might tell you that myths are primitive stories, or maybe religious fictions or some such. But myths are at once far more important than these definitions would lead us to assume. First, a myth is a story about the gods or the hero and heroes who interact with the gods, and the world and the relationship between humans and the world and the gods that impart some essential truth about how everything really works. The hero of a myth, and there usually is a hero, may or may not have existed, He may be a compilation of a number of long dead important people. He may never have existed at all. The story, the plot line of the story may never have actually happened. But the message of the story contains an essential, absolute truth, and this essential truth makes the whole story true. The essential ideas and morals that unfold in this story are meant to explain some absolute truth that humans should know as they operate within the universe. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the famous Lord of the Rings series, expressed this idea when he said, quote, "I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth, and indeed present aspects of truth that can only be received in this mode." Well, how do we classify myths? Myths are classified into several different categories based on the purpose and subject of the myth. First are creation myths, and they're often called cosmogonies. And creation myths have the function of explaining how the world came into existence. Creation myths. Second are ritual myths. Now, ritual myths are used to explain the origins and performance of religious practices. In other words, they exist to answer the question, why do we engage in the rituals that we engage in? Number three, origin myths describe the origins of social customs or particular names or objects. Number four, eschatological myths describe the catastrophic end of the present world order. In Christian tradition, these stories are called apocalyptical literature. The book of Revelations, for instance, in the New Testament is an example of this kind of eschatological myth. And finally, there are social myths. Social myths are stories that reinforce appropriate social behavior. In other words, they tell us how to behave. Well, today we're going to look primarily at the creation myths of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and we'll look at the first great epic of the West, a long epic poem, a Sumerian story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The myths of the Egyptians and Mesopotamians were extremely important because they influenced what men would think and how they would act and how they would organize themselves. They would also have a great influence on art and literature. Both the Egyptians and Mesopotamians had lots and lots of myths, but they were not the same because the conditions of life in these two areas of the world were different. So, let's start with Mesopotamia. Life in Mesopotamia was precarious, difficult, and uncertain. Mesopotamian cities were often threatened with flood or invasion, and as a result of this, Mesopotamian myths have a tendency to be quite pessimistic. The Mesopotamians have what we might call a fairly negative worldview. Mesopotamians explain the dangers of life through their myth of how the world was created. Now, there were a number of Mesopotamian creation myths. Probably the oldest and the most important in their literature is called the Enuma Elish, the Enuma Elish. It was first written down around 1800 BC, but it probably existed in a much earlier tradition, a much earlier oral format, and it's most likely a compilation of a number of different Sumerian myths. So, may date back to as much as 3000 BC. And it goes like this. In the beginning, and of course all creation myths pretty much start with in the beginning, basically, before the world came to be, nothing existed but one vast ocean. Most of the gods who control the world didn't exist yet. There were only two deities, two gods, a god and a goddess, Tiamat, the goddess of salt water, and Apsu, the god of sweet water, fresh water. And they mingled together in the ocean, and eventually, as the result of this mingling, the other gods were born, the land came into existence, and other natural phenomena began to exist as well. Then the war god, Enlil, gathered some of the gods together into an army. By military force, he defeated all of the other gods, and then through force and coercion, he assigned the gods and goddesses with their functions. In other words, what would they be gods and goddesses of? The organization of the gods in nature was based on the military power, the prowess of Enlil, just as the government of a Mesopotamian city was based on the military power of the king. Enlil created men, and he organized cities. The purpose of the creation of human beings was to serve the gods. Humans were to be slaves who worked for the good of the gods. So the cities and temple communities were created in the same way and at the same time as the natural world. It was no more possible to do away with kings and priests than it was to stop the rain or for men to destroy the gods. Men could not change their basic institutions, but it was possible for those institutions to be destroyed. Mesopotamian cities were often destroyed by floods or war. Mesopotamians were always afraid that the gods might destroy the world, might rain down death and destruction, and start over again. If that happened, the world would suddenly come to an end. And during the summer of each year, as the floods began to rise, the flood waters of the Tigris and Euphrates began to rise, men began to fear, humans began to fear that the world was coming to an end. They thought they were all about to be drowned and everything would become an ocean once more. Now, at this time of the year, just as the flood waters approached their height, Mesopotamians had their most important religious festival. It was called the Zagmuk. It was a New Year's festival, but it wasn't a particularly happy occasion. I doubt if there were little pointy hats or champagne or those noise makers. As the river waters rose, there was universal mourning. Everybody began to worry about the future, or maybe worse, that there wouldn't be one. The king's power weakened, and there was widespread immorality. Since the world was ending, human restraints were being removed as well. At the height of the flood, the people of the city would come together in the main temple and reenact Enlil's military victory over the other gods. The king usually would take the part of Enlil. By reenacting this victory, Mesopotamians believed that they would be able to keep the world going for another year. After the ceremony, the king would be recrowned, social ties would be restored, morality and order would be restored, and in most cases the floods would recede. And of course this made people believe that it had worked, that the Zagmuk festival had saved the world. Now, during the rest of the year, men had to keep on the good side of the gods by serving them and protecting the society that they had created. Artists and writers served the gods by producing works about the gods, religious content and purposes. For example, the major buildings of Mesopotamia were the great ziggurats, these enormous pyramidal temples. They would have to be rebuilt and repaired constantly, and this became a duty that the people had to the gods. Most Mesopotamian art, or much Mesopotamian art, I should say, depicts events from myths and often shows the king conquering his enemies with the help of the gods. But these myths, these artworks also frequently reflect the fear and uncertainty of Mesopotamian life. Now, the greatest work of Mesopotamian literature is a great epic poem, a long epic poem called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Epics are long stories that contain within them a whole lot of myths, a sort of encyclopedic narrative of ideas and values and associations. Epics narrate the story of a hero who is the embodiment of what a perfect man should be in the particular society that creates the epic. This particular epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells the story of a legendary Sumerian king of the great city of Uruk. The king's name, of course, is Gilgamesh. In the beginning of the epic, Gilgamesh is not a good king. He forces the young men to work on his building projects and fight in wars from which the city receives no gain. He beds young brides before they're married. His people become unhappy with him, and so they pray to the gods. They request help from the gods, and the gods create a creature named Enkidu. Now, Enkidu is part human, part beast, but in the story he represents nature. He is a friend of the wolves and the lions. He hunts with them. In the beginning of the story, he is sort of a noble savage, a nature man, if you will. And it is his purpose, the reason he is created by the gods, is to destroy Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh manages to tame Enkidu, and they become best friends. Together, they go on adventures. Together, they conquer hardships. They become closer and closer, more tightly bonded. And then the goddess Ishtar, the goddess of love, decides that she wants Gilgamesh to be her next boyfriend. Gilgamesh looks back at the stories of past boyfriends of Ishtar and comes to the sudden realization that their life expectancy is very short and very unhappy indeed. So Gilgamesh shuns Ishtar. Gilgamesh essentially says, go find somebody else I'm not interested. Ishtar is angry, and she manages to put a curse on Enkidu, and as a result of that curse, Enkidu sickens and dies. Gilgamesh is brokenhearted. Now, Mesopotamians believe that death is a terrible thing. The souls of the dead live in a dark, deserty environment, existing by eating mud and dust and clay. The afterlife is a terrible place, a place of unhappiness. And Gilgamesh decides to set out to find immortality, not only to bring back his buddy Enkidu, but also at this point, Gilgamesh is starting to get in touch with his own mortality. He's reaching that age where people begin to see that it's not going to be a happy ride forever. And so Gilgamesh wants to become immortal as well. Well, most of the rest of this epic discusses his quest for immortality. He goes through hardships and trials. He finally finds a branch from the tree of life, the leaves of which are supposed to give you immortality. And he is returning home to Uruk. When he gets within sight of the city, he decides that he's dusty and dirty from the road, so he will jump into a stream and take a bath. When he goes into the stream and takes a bath, a serpent comes and steals the branch from the tree of life. Gilgamesh returns home. His quest has failed. He won't achieve immortality for his friend or for himself. Life has become a failure. Now, he spends the rest of his life as a good king. Nevertheless, he has failed to acquire immortality. Well, let's take a look for a bit now about Egyptian myths and the Egyptian worldview and sort of try to spot some differences. The first thing I should say is through most of its history, Egypt was not threatened by destructive floods. Peace and political stability were the rule in Egypt. Only on very rare occasions was Egypt not at peace, was chaos in evidence in Egypt. By and large, for most Egyptians, life was good. Now, for the peasants, the folks who worked out in the fields, life was hard, but the bounty that came from that hard work was large. And so, by and large, Egyptians believed that their world was secure and serene and unchanging. Secure, serene, and unchanging. An interesting thing about the Egyptians was that basically they never met a god or goddess they didn't like. Now, in most cultures, as one culture expands and takes in new territory and new peoples, what generally happens in the religion is something called assimilation. That is, as the culture expands and takes in new people with different gods, the dominant culture tends to assimilate these new gods and identify them with the god that they already have. So, for instance, when the Akkadians expand into Samaria, they already had a chief god, the Akkadians did, and he was named Marduk. Now, when the Akkadians expand into Samaria and they learn about Enlil, the older Sumerian war god, the older Sumerian king of the gods, what the Akkadians do is they take the attributes of Enlil and they give them to their god Marduk. So in the Akkadian version, for instance, of the Enuma Elish, all the references to Enlil are removed and they're all replaced with the name Marduk. This is how assimilation basically works. When the Romans became more and more conversant with Greek religion, they assimilated many of the ideas, many of the characteristics of the Greek god Zeus into their head god, who was called Jupiter. And this is basically assimilation. Happens a great deal in the past, where you have lots of pantheist type religions as they come into contact with each other. The Egyptians weren't like that. Now, the Egyptians simply accepted the new god or goddess, and they grew their pantheon, they grew their gods in terms of numbers, out of all proportion to any other civilization we know of. I'll give you an example. In fact, you already have an example. We have talked about 3 sun gods in the Egyptian lecture. We talked about Amun, we talked about Horus, we talked about Aten, actually 4. We talked about Ra. These are all sun gods. You have to wonder whether they fight with each other to get the sun across the sky. The Egyptians have a vast number of different myths that they have acquired as they've acquired new gods. Many different explanations for the creation, but probably the most typical one is found in a story, a myth called the Theology of Memphis. The Theology of Memphis. And it seems to have been written down around 2700 BC. In other words, it's actually written in the Old Kingdom period. So let's take a look at it. In the beginning, in much the same way that Mesopotamian creation myths start, the world began as water, and the various gods were born from the water. But the Egyptian gods were not compelled to assume their jobs in nature by military force. The Egyptian creator god is named Ptah, P-T-A-H. He's not a war god. He is the god of wisdom and magic. He creates the world by dividing the water from the land through magic and the sheer force of his will. He also uses magical power and the force of his mind, his ability to persuade, if you will, to assign the gods to their jobs. Thus, the Egyptian world is founded not on warfare, not out of chaos, but on reason and wisdom. It is completely stable and unchanging. To ensure stability, Ptah assigns the Pharaoh to rule over humans in this life in the form of Horus, and to rule over humans in the land of the dead in the form of Osiris, the judge of the dead. Just as in Mesopotamia, Egyptians could not change their government. The state was a product of nature, just as the gods were a product of nature and wisdom. For the Egyptians, though, that was okay, because they believed their world was pretty near perfect, just like everything else in life. The optimistic view that life is great and it will always be great is reflected in a number of aspects of Egyptian culture and thought, culture and literature. It was only during the intermediate periods, the first and second intermediate that I talked about last time, that Egyptians began to worry that perhaps things weren't always going to be happy. Now, Egyptians even developed a happy idea about death and the afterlife. They thought that the soul of man had three interconnected parts. The most important of those parts was called the ka, and they believed that the ka lived forever. When a human being died on earth, the ka would ascend to the afterlife. It contained the embodiment of the human, what we would call the human soul. Now, during the Old Kingdom, we have pretty good reason to believe that Egyptians believed that the only person that had a ka was the king, that only the king would be transformed to the next life. But during the Middle Kingdom, the idea arose that everybody had a ka, that everybody had a shot at the afterlife. Now, as it was pictured in art and described in literature, this next world was pretty much the same as this one, only way better. There were no hardships in it. Life was even better than it had been in the Nile Valley. The soul of the dead would go through a difficult journey. At the end of that journey, the soul would be tested by the god of the dead, Osiris. The deceased person's heart would be weighed on a scale against a feather, and if the heart, probably metaphorical heart, spiritual heart, was lighter than the feather, then the person would be admitted, the deceased would be admitted to the afterlife. If the feather if the feather was lighter than the heart, then the soul of the dead would be thrown into a fiery lake to be gnawed on for eternity by a giant hippopotamus. Couldn't make that one up. The soul was also tested by Osiris. There was apparently a sort of a question and answer period in which the soul had an opportunity to justify its life on this earth. And Egyptians believed that it was possible to beat the game, so they began to provide notes to the dead to ensure that nobody would be kept out of the afterlife. These notes were compiled in something called the Book of the Dead, and this material, this guide to the journey to Osiris, guide on what to say to Osiris, religious incantations, magical incantations that would essentially sell Osiris that you were a good guy and you should go to heaven, were often painted on tomb walls and written on funerary wrappings, on mummy wrappings, so that you could bone up in your tomb for these exams, awaiting the call to rise and move on. It was once thought that Egyptians were morbid because they spent so much time in their art and literature dealing with death. But now we're beginning to believe that that was primarily because they looked forward to death with hopeful anticipation. Egyptian art reflects a happy, serene outlook just in the way it was done, how it was developed, and what it shows. Modern observers often find Egyptian art sort of strange, sort of funny, because the figures are represented in a curious way. The head and feet are shown from the side, and the body and legs are generally shown from a straight-on view. There's a reason for this. Egyptians believed that in a perfect human figure, all of the parts of the body should be in exact proportion to all of the other parts. Let me say that again. All of the parts of the body should be in exact proportion to all of the other parts. Egyptians painted in such a way that they would show this by turning the body in different directions so that the viewer could see that the proportions were perfect. This method of depicting human figures was created very early, probably in the period called the pre-dynastic period, even before the Old Kingdom, and it didn't change at all for nearly 3,000 years. That's very significant. The Egyptians considered their art to be perfect, and if it's perfect, you don't change it. The content of Egyptian art is also optimistic. Most Egyptian art shows pictures of everyday life in Egypt. As we might expect, much of the art that we have is pictures of the pharaoh, who after all was the central being in Egyptian life and culture. All Egyptian art revolved around the pharaoh, all Egyptian life revolved around the pharaoh, and the Egyptians believed that they would be happy and prosperous only as long as the pharaoh ruled. Now, this may be a strange idea to us, but as we see when we look at Egypt, it's essentially historically true. As long as the pharaoh is strong, as long as the pharaoh rules, life in Egypt is stable and happy. Paintings in Egyptian tombs often depict daily activities such as planting or harvesting grain, hunting birds in the marshes, or partaking in feasts and parties. Now, archaeologists used to believe and used to write that these depictions of everyday activities were meant to connect the dead to this world. That is, they were meant to show the dead how good life had been, sort of a look what you're missing point of view. Archaeologists are beginning to believe now, the more they study, and for the last 20 or so years, archaeologists have begun to argue this is not the case. These tomb paintings show the deceased what life in the next world will be like. Put simply, these tomb paintings say, if you liked the world of the living, you'll like the world of the dead even more, because you'll be doing the same stuff, only it will all be better. Some tomb paintings, for instance, show workers cutting grain, cutting wheat, just like they would have on this earth. But if you look closely, you see first that instead of being about this high, the wheat is about this high, and the grain on it, instead of being about this much grain, is about this much. What this painting is saying is there was plenty among the living, there will be even more plenty among the dead. Another often shown picture, tomb painting of Egypt, is a pharaoh standing in the front of a boat and shooting birds with a bow and arrow, an activity that actually took place a good bit in the Nile Delta. But if you look carefully at the painting, what you begin to realize is there are so many birds in the scene, that the scene is so cluttered with wildlife that this guy doesn't even have to aim to hit something. It is, again, an illustration that life will be bountiful in the next world. You like this one, you'll love the next one. Party scenes have more food, more drink, more beautiful dancers, more. The next world is filled with everything that we love in this world, but there's just way more of it. So, if we look at Mesopotamian and Egyptian culture as a whole, perhaps the most curious feature of it to us is the idea that political and economic and social institutions are a part of nature. We tend to see these institutions as essentially man-made institutions, but the ancient peoples of Egypt and Mesopotamia believe that they are part of the whole of the world, the whole of nature. And of course, they're governed by the same rules as the rest of nature, the same forces that cause the sun to rise and set, cause the river to rise and flood and recede. They can never be changed. They are essentially eternal, just as nature is eternal. Now, of course, we've seen that change did take place in the Near East, but especially in the case of Egypt, it was so slight and so gradual that Near Easterners were essentially unaware of it. At any given time, men really didn't know about the way life had been in their grandfather or great-grandfather's time. They were unaware that minor changes had taken place over a long period of time. And so they had no history. The idea of history really hadn't come into existence. They couldn't compare conditions in their time with conditions in the remote past. And so they believed that life, society, economics, government was essentially natural and unchanging. They tended to think that their present conditions must exist everywhere and always, and that their way of organizing themselves and their view of the world and the universe and everything was the only possible way to view life and the world and the universe and everything. Later on, this would make it difficult for these peoples to adjust to new conditions that would arise at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, and once more later in their history. It would be difficult for them to make the changes necessary in order to continue their existence.
I hope you enjoyed Dr. Price's lecture on Egyptian and Mesopotamian worldviews. It's very interesting to me that these people could live so very close together in our world. In modern times, the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians weren't that far apart. We're talking Iraq and Egypt today, but yet they developed so very differently. They didn't have a lot of contact, not instant communication back in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East. So it was very interesting to see how they developed differently and how they viewed their world and their religion. Until next time.